Hello everyone, and welcome to a new series for the World Championship this year, Worlds 2023, called the Major Region Rundown, where I'm going to give you the rundown of all the teams coming out of the major regions that maybe you weren't following domestically for the entire year, and now you're here to watch Worlds and you want to know their story in a quick, 5 to 6 minute rundown of their year, what they were like last year and what to expect for them coming into the tournament. Let's start off with the LCK. Now, coming out of the LCK as the first seed, we've got GENG. GENG's roster, of course, is Doran, Peanut, Chovy, Paze, and Delight. Now, a lot of you last year might remember the roster with Ruler and Lehens, where they lost 3-1 to DRX in the World Semifinals of 2022. And since then, the team lost that bot lane and had to find a new one. They actually went for Paze, who was from their academy team, and Delight, who came from Bro last year, which I think a lot of people were not sure how this bot lane would perform. Paze was looking incredible in the academy, so a lot of people were excited for him. And so this pairing was a bit of a question mark. We weren't really sure what to expect. But quick rundown. Paze, 17 years old. Now, think about that for a second. 17 years old. Faker is 27. It's season 13. 10 years ago, Faker won Worlds when Paze was 7 years old. I think he's the youngest player of the tournament. I'd have to fact check that, but I think he is. And it's his first World Championship. Paze, wow, what a superstar. He won LCK Summer 2023 kill record. He broke that. He won Rookie of the Year. He won MVP in the Spring Finals. He won LCK second and third All-Pro. This kid has been so consistent, has performed so well in some of the highest pressure matches in only his first year in the LCK. And you think about it, this is a league with Gumayushi. This is a league with Aiming, with Deft, with Viper, a lot of talented AD carries. Standing out amongst them is tough. But Paze, wow, he's been showing up. A lot of people might remember GENG from last year, and their weakness was Doran. People always thought Doran was the weakness of GENG, or the worst player in general, and if they had like a really strong top laner, maybe this team could do better. Alongside them having this kind of criticism around them about choking at internationals in terms of, Worlds last year especially, where, Chovy looked like he wasn't as comfortable, making mistakes in that semifinals against DRX with the Rise ult, maybe playing a bit more scared than he should have. So I think the two biggest weaknesses of GENG last year were Doran. And it sounds weird to say weakness, but relative to other top laners like Zeus 369 and, in the end, players like Kingen and even Nuguri at the tournament, people were always hyping in internationals. Doran was definitely overshadowed by names like that. But I think that weakness has been covered off, which is good news for GENG fans. I think Doran's been having an amazing year, especially towards summer and playoffs, holding his own. The meta right now is good for him. I think Jax, Renekton, Cassante, Gnar meta has really helped him find his form, find his footing. The Aatrox meta came in briefly, and his Aatrox is good. He's got counters to Aatrox like Camille, and his safe blind picks have always been GP, so he's got a plethora of champions and no longer looks like this kind of weak point for GENG. Two of the biggest strengths of GENG, I think, are Delight and Peanut. Peanut has always been this incredibly consistent jungler, one of the best in the world. I think his pathing has always been really efficient. A lot of people think back to the Canyon versus Peanut game 5 with Nidalee, where he was playing Hecarim, and I think it was Hecarim, and he just couldn't jungle, getting all his camp stolen away from him. But yeah, happens, one game things do happen, but that doesn't set the tone for how the player performs. And yeah, Peanut's just so amazing. I think he's probably a big voice in GENG, because GENG's playstyle is very, I don't want to use the word slow, but they are very happy in even game states because their macro is so crisp. They are so smart about trading evenly or trading to make sure they're slightly coming out on top or ahead. So I expect that Peanut plays a big part in that. Their other big strength is Delight. What an engager. Now, Delight's lane phase alongside Paze isn't super oppressive. We're not looking at laners here who are going to take your tower and keep you under a lot of pressure, because that's just not the meta in bot lane right now. Meta in bot lane is kind of scaling ADs or skirmishing mid-game ADs like Kalista with melee supports. Now, that's got more kill pressure rather than lane pressure, and so you don't expect to see these like 20, 30 CS lead and insane tower platings taken. I think Paze's team fights are insane. Micro is incredible. Positioning is on point. Kind of like a baby Ruler at this point. And Delight's engages have always been super crisp all year long. I think Delight was robbed personally of MVP in the summer finals. I was a big fan of the way Delight performed against T1. But despite the shaky moments like at the end of the split or against T1, GENG's year overall has been really, really consistent. And I think this is the team you're looking at as the best team from the LCK. Obviously, they won the final, so it's easy to say that. But sometimes, you can think that teams are robbed or whatever it is. But definitely, I think GENG is the strongest team coming out of the LCK. Moving on to the LCK second seed, which is T1. Now, the roster is, of course, Zeus, Owner, Faker, Gumayushi, and Keria. They kept the same roster from Worlds Finals last year, where they lost 3-2 to DRX. A lot of people remember that finals. It was iconic with Faker and Def. A lot of people saw T1 as the favorites. close, so close to getting their World Championship title, which that year I think they were performing very well. They just kept losing all these finals in 5-game series internationals, and it was just such a sting to see, such a pain to see. They kept dropping out like that. So a lot of fans in this World Championship really hope that T1 can pull it through, because this might be the last time this roster is ever together. A lot of people are speculating it, but it's very likely that this roster changes for next year, which would be sad to see, that they didn't ever claim an international title together when they were so dominant. Because you look at this year, I think they had one of the weirdest years in league history for a team. They went 17-1 in the regular season in spring. They lost the finals, even though they were the favorites. They went to MSI. They lost out to BLG and JDG, and they didn't actually make the finals of MSI. T1 domestically in summer, they lost Faker. They had to sub in their mid laner Poby for quite a hefty amount of the split. The reason they subbed out Faker was he was having wrist injuries. He was having a bit of issues with his wrist. He couldn't actually play the game, so he had to be medically removed from the roster on the bench until he could fix that. And I think it's fixed now. Faker should be in form. He's been grinding solo queue. Just to give you some perspective on that regular season, they were 6-2 in sets in the summer regular season. Faker then left the team to, take care of his medical problems. He then returned when the team was 7-9. So they actually won 1 set and they lost 7. This team was, I think they were like 6th place. There was times where I was questioning if they were going to make playoffs without Faker. The team just collapsed. Faker came back when they were 7-9, and they finished 9-9. They then beat Damwon in the first round of playoffs. KT then picked to play against T1, mainly because T1 probably didn't have as much time to practice with Faker, and they thought they could expose that weakness. And KT was looking like one of the best teams in the LCK, maybe the best team in the regular season, because they did finish first. They won All Pro first, but we'll get to that later. But they lost. T1 won 3-2 against KT, which was a big surprise to everyone. T1 then went to the upper bracket finals, I think it was, and they lost 3-2 to GENG, but the fact they made it close was quite surprising. After having lost to GENG 3-2, they went on to the next round in the lower bracket, and they faced KT again, where they won 3-2. Now, if you're excited for Worlds and you want to see some of the best domestic series all year long, I have to really recommend T1 versus KT was probably the best rivalry in all regions throughout the year. They played 3 series. This year, in spring, they played 1. In summer, they played 2. All 3 of them went to 5 games. There was close backdoors from Keen's Jace and things like this. It was incredible. So highly recommend that. They went on to the finals. They lost 3-0 to GENG. Now, they were very figured out by that time. You have to imagine this team had very little practice. They didn't have their mid laner for the majority of the split. And they could only play certain styles to find wins because they didn't have the time to practice anything else. So you come into that finals, they've been playing Nico Azir every game. They've been playing Lulu every game. They didn't really have many options other than Zeus, but the game wasn't really about top lane. So I think it was a bit of a struggle for T1 when they got to that finals. GENG had so much information that the drafts were just really hard to win, and T1 bombed out of that finals. Strengths and weaknesses. Obviously, I think I don't want to say the worst player on T1. I like to highlight the weakest player. Now, that doesn't mean that they're bad. It just means that this was a bit of a liability throughout the year. I think it's Owner. Think back to MSI. The Kindred didn't really work out very well. During the summer regular season, Owner didn't look like himself when Faker wasn't there especially. And he hasn't been at that consistent performance that we saw him at last year. Last year, I feel like the weaker player on T1 was Gumayushi, because in spring, there was this Jinx Aphelios meta that then shifted to like Kalista Zeri, and he couldn't seem to find his transition into that. He eventually did, but at the start, a bit weak. Now Owner, I feel like, is the one struggling, so I'm keeping my eye on him to see if he performs at the World Championship. I expect him to do so with so much time and Faker being back, but that would be my tiny bit of concern for T1. Now, this team has always had super creative map plays around the Baron. I think Keria is one of the voices for that. He's so smarted when it comes down to sneaking Nash, rushing down Nash. So keep your eye out for that in how they play the map. And yeah, I think this team, they've got superstars across the board. So they might not be the favorites coming into the World Championship because of how shaky their year was. But this team has incredible players that have been at the highs of League of Legends competition. I would never count them out. A lot of people are thinking that JDG and GENG are the favorites for this Worlds, but yeah, T1 is right behind them. Now, moving on to the 3rd seed of the LCK, you've got KT. Don't get excited. So the roster is Keen, Cuz, BDD, Aiming, and Lehends. Oh my god, never get excited about KT, I'm gonna say it again. Think back to 2018, where they could have won Worlds with the UCAL roster if they managed to take one more game off of IG in that Worlds quarterfinals that was so intense, where Jackie Love made that big step up. KT have always been so close, but yet so far. The team was leveling up so much this year, throughout spring and throughout summer. I think the first time people really turned their heads to KT, in my opinion, was that T1 best of 5 in spring, where they almost beat them because T1 was looking so dominant, and then KT almost took the best of 5. So a lot of people got excited then. And then I think throughout summer, they just looked really strong. I mean, their regular season is undeniably one of the best regular seasons they've ever had, I think. A lot of people got super excited for them because of that. that, and this team looked unstoppable. They won first All-Pro in every single role. They won first All-Pro. A lot of people looked at KT and said, wow, this team was amazing. And I agree. But in hindsight, after some reflection, I feel like KT thrived because teams around them struggled. I don't want to take away any of their success, but let's just run through it. Damwon couldn't figure out which support to play with. They were swapping in 2 supports. We'll talk about that later. Kana was being really inconsistent, and Showmaker and Canyon weren't functioning as well as we'd seen them do throughout summer. Hanwha Life lost their jungler Clid and had to sub in Grizzly. They were a bit inconsistent. Grizzly was finding form for a couple weeks, but then it fell out a couple weeks later. T1 was struggling a lot with Faker having left and not having enough practice. So that's 3 of the top 5 teams which already were kind of out of it. And then you've got GENG, who then lost to Bro, which I think a lot of people turned their heads and were like, how did GENG lose to Bro? So coming into playoffs, KT was like hyped as an amazing team. And I think, again, I don't want to take anything away from their regular season. They had a very interesting playoffs run. I think they got memed for picking T1, and every team around them struggling made it so people were skeptical. But people were still excited. Unfortunately, they lost to T1 both times in the best of 5s. So they are the 3rd seed coming out of the LCK. But this team has got some really good players on it. People might remember BDD. He's been around for a long time. I think he was coming into Longzhu or Kingzone all that time ago. Or CJ Entus, I remember. Something like that, where he was supposed to be the prodigy that'll take down Faker. And he's had high highs and low lows. I think his lowest of low was last year on Nongshim, where they had the super team with Ghost and Kana from T1. Ghost from Damwon that year. And the team just didn't function. They bombed out, didn't make playoffs. And BDD, yeah, not the best of times. But BDD is having one of the best years of his career. I think if any player deserved to win first All-Pro on that roster, it was BDD. He had amazing performances on Zoe at Worlds as well. People remember that. I think it was with GENG. This player has always been very impressive, so it's nice to see him back at Worlds. A lot of people have thought of him as this Azir one trick, but as much as he's been playing Azir this year, I think he's definitely in his most complete form that we've seen him in years. Alongside having players like Keen, who people have regarded as one of the best top laners in the world for so many years. Aiming, who has been kind of underrated. I think he's an incredible AD carry. Basically solo carried them through a lot of sketchy games. So yeah, those are the 3 players I'm looking at. They've got Lehens from GENG last year and Kuz, who was previously a T1 player. So this team, definitely an interesting one. Don't use the word excited ever. That's the meme around KT rather, is you don't get excited about KT because the second you do, they disappoint you. So yeah, we'll keep our eye on them. They're the 3rd seed from the LCK. Now, coming out of the 4th seed from the LCK, we've got Damwon. Now, oh, Damwon, where do we start? Well, let's start with their roster. They've got Kana, Canyon, Showmaker, Deft, Kellen, and Bible. This team has had a very underwhelming year. I'm just going to say it. You think back to last year at Worlds, where they lost to GENG in that 5-game series, where they had, you know, Dokdam and Nuguri and Kellen, and a lot of people regarded Dokdam as this Aphelios one trick, and they wanted Aphelios Lulu all the time, and then Canyon had this amazing Kayn play, but then they lost the game, and, you know, a lot of people were seeing Canyon as one of the best junglers in the world, and there was so many high highs, but it just didn't work out for them. Now coming into this year, Nuguri retired, Dokdam was replaced, and they signed Deft, who just won Worlds. So that's why a lot of people were excited for this team. They were like, wow, Canyon Showmaker with Deft, this is going to be an insane super team. And then Kana, who also just came off the back of Nongshim with BDD, where they had, you know, Ghost from Damwon, BDD from GENG, Kana from T1. This was supposed to be like this insane team that bombed out. So not the best of years, but this roster was supposed to be a superstar roster alongside Hanwha Life, who was also kind of like, I don't want to say the sister team, but it felt like Hanwha Life and Damwon were just battling back and forth all throughout the year. You know, Hanwha Life beat them in spring. Hanwha Life had Viper, Zeka, and Kingin. Damwon has Showmaker, Canyon, and Deft. It was so amazing. I think LCK this year was so fun to watch, but they were basically fighting for 3rd and 4th in the regular seasons in general. Damwon actually lost in the playoffs in spring and summer in round 1. In spring, they lost to Hanwha Life. In summer, they lost to T1, and I don't think this was the year that Damwon fans wanted. They had a lot of problems with swapping in and out their support. Kellen was coming in, and he was like this better lane phase player, but then Bible was coming in because he was like a better teamfight shot caller, and everything was just a bit inconsistent. Kana had performances that were up and down throughout the year, but they kind of cleaned up towards the end of the year, which was a good note. And that's basically the story of Damwon. You kind of sat there all year being like, when is this roster going to work? And I kind of think it only really came together in the regionals, where they beat DRX handily and they beat Hanwha Life handily to claim that last world spot. We've talked a lot about Damwon, but we haven't really spoken about Showmaker yet. And Showmaker to me has been the interesting player because I think Showmaker's been, you know, the last few years one of the best mids in the LCK. It's been like the Faker, Chovy, Showmaker, almost like the Egyptian god cards. You know, you've got the red T1 Faker, you've got the yellow GENG of Chovy, and you've got the blue of Showmaker in Damwon, which has always been like this cool kind of triangle of mid laners that the LCK has had. But Showmaker, yeah, he kind of fell off a little bit this year. Now, fell off is relative in terms of his performance. You know, it's more like BDD was was the one rising up. And I think Showmaker lost a lot of enjoyment from the game. Maybe he was a bit more burnt out. He lost a little bit of confidence. It was sad to see. It was very hard to tell what it was from the outside, but his performance wasn't the Showmaker we know and love. But again, he was the one who also came to life towards the end of the summer regional finals. So I think Showmaker might be back in form. I think Kana might have found his form, and I think they might have found their formula for which support they want to play with, and that's Kellen. Because Kellen was playing amazing in those regionals. His engages were flawless. The team just looked so much more cohesive, and everything was slowly coming together. And I just want to touch on Canyon again, because he's had a bit of ups and downs throughout the year. He still dominates overall, and I think people still regard him as one of the best junglers in the world. He topped the MVP votes in the regular season, won the most POG points in summer next to Zeka. And you could kind of see from behind the scenes footage that I feel like the read that the team was going for, they couldn't seem to align on how to play the game properly. They had disagreements here and there, which I think was hindering them a bit as well. But again, everything finally clicked. All of these weaknesses I felt like kind of disappeared in those last two best of fives. It wasn't the biggest sample size and it wasn't the best of teams in the LCK, but they looked a cut above them. So for me, they're my dark horse. 4th seed coming out of the LCK. DRX won Worlds last year, coming out of the LCK as the 4th seed, having won a 5-game series to even get there in the first place against Sandbox, and no one had expectations for them, and they won Worlds. So be careful. You never know what a team with Canyon, Showmaker, and Deft can do at Worlds. That was it for the major region rundown. The whole consensus of the video was just to give you a rundown of the LCK teams coming into Worlds, because maybe you haven't watched them domestically, maybe you don't know who's on the roster, maybe you don't know what their year was like, but I hope that gave you a little bit more insight, and yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you again on the next one.